The journalist had been asking questions for 40 minutes, good questions, sharp questions, the kind that usually made people either defensive or performatively philosophical. Marlon Brando had answered all of them with the particular kind of intelligence that made interviewers feel simultaneously brilliant and slightly outmaneuvered. And then the journalist asked the one question nobody was supposed to ask, and Brando went completely still. And when he finally spoke, it was 7 words. 7 words that made the room go so quiet you could hear the tape recorder turning. 7 words that the journalist would repeat verbatim to everyone he knew for the rest of his life because he understood, in the moment he heard them, that he had just been given something most people spend entire careers chasing and never find: the truth, plain and unperformed, from the most performed human being on the planet. But to understand why those 7 words hit the way they did, you have to understand what it cost someone like Marlon Brando to stop performing, even for a single sentence. Because for Brando, performance wasn't just a profession. It was, for most of his life, the only protection he had. Before we go any further, if stories like this one matter to you, if you believe that the real lives behind famous faces are always more extraordinary than the famous face itself, subscribe to this channel right now and turn on the notifications. We find these stories every week. The ones that never made the headlines, the ones that only the people in the room ever knew. And this one, this particular story from a hotel suite in Los Angeles in the autumn of 1979, almost disappeared entirely. Almost. Stay with us. It was October 1979. Marlon Brando was 55 years old. Apocalypse Now had just been released, and the world was in the process of deciding what to make of it, of the film, of Francis Ford Coppola's vision, and particularly of the 10 minutes at the end of that film that belonged entirely to Brando, Colonel Kurtz, a man who had gone so far into the darkness that he had arrived somewhere on the other side of it, somewhere that looked from a certain angle almost like clarity. Critics were divided about the film. Nobody was divided about Brando. Even people who found the ending overlong, even people who had complicated feelings about what Coppola was attempting, agreed that what Brando did in those scenes was something outside the normal categories of film performance, something that didn't have a clean vocabulary yet, which meant the press wanted to talk to him, which meant Brando, who had a lifelong and well-documented complicated relationship with the press, was doing interviews, reluctantly, carefully, in the specific way that Brando did things he didn't entirely want to do, with complete presence and underlying resistance, simultaneously cooperative and fundamentally elsewhere. The journalist that October afternoon was Lawrence Grobel. He was good at his job in the particular way that the best interviewers are good, not because he was aggressive, not because he tried to trip people up, but because he listened, really listened. The kind of listening that creates space for people to say more than they intended. He had done it with other subjects. He had never done it with anyone quite like Marlon Brando. They had been talking for 40 minutes when it happened. The conversation had moved through the expected territories. The film, the role, the famous stories about Brando's unconventional approach to preparation, his refusal to memorize lines in the traditional sense, his insistence on finding the emotional truth of a scene rather than executing it technically. Brando had been generous with his answers, more generous than his reputation suggested he would be. He had talked about Kurtz with genuine thoughtfulness. He had talked about Coppola with affection and the occasional carefully deployed edge. He had been, in other words, exactly the version of himself that he chose to present when he had decided someone was worth being honest with. And then Grobel set down his pen. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable, but Brando noticed everything. He noticed the pen going down and understood it meant the next question was going to be different from the ones before it. Grobel looked at him and said, "Where does it come from? The real stuff. Not the technique you've talked about, technique. I mean the thing underneath the technique. When you play a man breaking apart, when you play a man who has gone past the point of return, where do you actually go to find that? What do you reach into?" The room was quiet. Grobel's assistant, who had been sitting to the side taking notes, stopped writing. The tape recorder kept turning. Brando was quiet for a long moment. Not the theatrical quiet of a man building to a performance, the actual quiet of a man deciding something. The difference is visible if you know what to look for. In the shoulders, in the hands, in whether the eyes are focused or slightly interior. Brando's eyes went interior, and then he said it. 7 words, spoken quietly without drama, with no apparent awareness that they were extraordinary. My father never once said, "Well done." The room didn't react immediately. That's the thing about a sentence like that, delivered the way Brando delivered it, not as a wound being displayed, not as a confession being performed, but as a simple statement of fact, a coordinate on a map. The room took a second to understand what it had just received. And then the quiet landed. the specific quality of silence that follows something true. Grobel didn't write anything down. He didn't reach for his pen. He just looked at Brando and waited. Because he understood instinctively that reaching for the pen would break something that needed to stay unbroken for a moment longer. Now, before we go further into what happened next in that room, this is exactly the moment where we need to go backward. Because those 7 words didn't arrive in that hotel suite from nowhere. They arrived from Omaha, Nebraska. They arrived from a childhood that shaped Marlon Brando more completely than any acting teacher, any director, any role ever did. They arrived from a man named Marlon Brando Sr., and from the specific silence that existed between a father and a son who never found the language for each other. Marlon Brando Sr. was not a monster. That's important to say clearly, because the temptation when telling a story like this is to make the father a villain, and Brando himself resisted that simplification for his entire life. His father was a traveling salesman, mostly absent, present on weekends in ways that were more complicated than absence, because absence, at least, sets no expectations. Presence that is cold and evaluating, and withholding, that is something else. That teaches a child something very specific about what they need to do to earn the warmth that never quite comes. Marlon Brando Sr. was a man who valued toughness, who believed that approval given freely was approval cheapened, who communicated through criticism with occasional gaps of neutrality, never through praise. Young Marlon absorbed this the way children absorb everything, not as a lesson to be learned, but as a law of nature, as a fact about how the world worked. If you did something well, the response was silence, or something that pointed toward what still wasn't good enough. If you did something badly, the response was something sharper. Brando's mother, Dorothy, was the warmth in the house. Beautiful, sensitive, theatrical in ways that her son would inherit completely, and slowly being consumed by alcoholism in ways that her son would also inherit the shadow of. She loved him openly, extravagantly, in the specific way that some mothers love sons who remind them of everything they themselves might have been. And she was not reliable. The warmth was real, but intermittent. The love was genuine, but the person carrying it kept flickering. What do you do with that as a child? What do you do when the person who sees you is disappearing and the person who is present doesn't quite see you? You learn to perform. You learn that the space between what you feel and what you show is a space you can control, and control is the only power available to someone small in a world of people who are larger and less predictable than they should be. You learn to watch people carefully, because watching carefully is how you survive in a house where the emotional weather changes without warning. You become, without knowing the word for it, an actor. The stage just formalized something that was already Brando's primary survival skill. He left Nebraska at 19, carrying almost nothing. He arrived in New York City and found his way to the actor's studio, to Stella Adler, to the method which is, at its core, a formalization of exactly what Brando had been doing since childhood. Finding the emotional truth of a moment from the inside out. Not pretending to feel something, actually feeling it. The difference between those two things was something Brando understood in his body before he understood it intellectually. He had been doing it his whole life. The studio gave him language for it. But here's the thing that nobody who talks about Brando's technique ever quite says plainly enough. The emotional material he drew from was not abstract. It was not some general reservoir of human experience that trained actors access through careful craft. It was specific. It was Nebraska. It was Marlon Sr.'s silence at every report card, every recital, every moment that a different father would have put a hand on a boy's shoulder and said something simple and permanent. That silence had a texture and a weight and a temperature that Brando knew the way you know the house you grew up in the dark, from memory, without needing to think about where the walls are. Every broken man he ever played. Every man reaching for something just beyond what he could hold. Every man whose dignity was intact while everything around it was collapsing. Those performances came from that specific reservoir, not from technique, not from craft, though the craft was extraordinary, from the real thing, from the accumulated weight of a childhood that taught him what longing feels like from the inside. So, when Lawrence Grobel asked him where it came from, and the pen went down and the room went quiet, and Brando said 7 words, "My father never once said well done," what he was doing was not performing vulnerability for an interviewer. He was doing the one thing that was almost impossible for him. He was being entirely himself, without the character, without the distance that character provides, without the protection of pretending to be someone who was feeling what he was actually feeling. He was just Marlon, the boy from Nebraska, saying the true thing. After the 7 words, there was the silence, and then Grobel did something that Brando, by his own account later, did not expect. He nodded. Not the nod of someone moving to the next question, the nod of someone who understood, who had perhaps heard something that resonated with something in his own experience. And he said quietly, "Did he know what he did to you?" Brando looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "He probably thought he was making me stronger. He wasn't trying to do damage. He just didn't have the vocabulary for the other thing." Some men don't. You inherit that from your own fathers. And if nobody breaks the chain somewhere along the line, it just keeps going. The assistant in the corner had stopped even pretending to take notes. Grobel asked, "Did you break it? With your own children?" And this is where the story becomes something other than a story about the past. Because Brando's face changed. Not dramatically. He was not a man who showed things dramatically in private, only on screen. But something shifted in the architecture of his expression. Something that was not quite pain and not quite regret and not quite the particular exhaustion of a question you have asked yourself too many times in the dark to be able to answer it cleanly in the daylight. He said, "I tried. I don't think I got all the way there. I got further than he did. Whether that's enough?" He stopped. He looked at his hands. He said, "I don't know if enough is the right measuring stick. When it's your children, enough doesn't feel like a category that applies." Grobel didn't push. He understood he was in a different kind of conversation now than the one he had arrived to have. He had come to talk about a film, and he had ended up somewhere that the film was almost incidental to. He waited, and Brando, unprompted, continued. He said, "The thing nobody tells you about becoming famous," and I don't mean this as a complaint. I want to be clear about that. I understand what I was given, and I'm not ungrateful for it. But the thing nobody tells you is that the qualities that make you extraordinary at the work are often the same qualities that make ordinary life very difficult. The attention, the capacity to feel things at a register that most people would find unbearable, the inability to be in a room without being aware of every emotional current in it. Those things make you good at what I do. They also make you very hard to live with, very hard to be a father with, because children need consistency more than they need intensity. And I was always better at intensity. The tape recorder kept turning. Outside the hotel window, Los Angeles went about its business, entirely unaware that in a suite on the 14th floor, one of the most famous human beings on the planet was sitting quietly with his hands in his lap and telling the truth about himself. He told Grobel something that afternoon that Grobel did not publish for years. He told him that the role he was most proud of in his career was not Stanley Kowalski, not Terry Malloy, not Vito Corleone. Though he understood why people chose that one, the role he was most proud of, he said, was one nobody had seen. It was the version of himself he had been attempting to construct, late in his life, in the spaces between everything else. The father who called more consistently, the man who sat quietly on a beach in Tetioro with his children and didn't need to be anywhere more interesting. The person who had learned, slowly and imperfectly, that presence was not the same thing as performance, and that the people who loved you needed the former, not the latter. He said, "I got better at it. I don't want to pretend I solved it, because I didn't. But I got better." And I think he paused. I think my father would have said that getting better is the same as failing, because it means you weren't good enough to begin with. He paused again. And I think my father was wrong about that. I think getting better is actually the whole story. I think that's all any of us can honestly offer. By this point, the 40-minute interview had become something closer to 2 hours. The light outside the hotel window had shifted from afternoon to early evening. Someone knocked on the suite door at some point. Brando's assistant, checking whether he needed anything, and Brando waved the interruption away without looking toward the door. He talked about his mother, about coming home from school and finding the house in the particular kind of disarray that a child learns to read quickly and accurately. The specific texture of a bad day, the location of the bourbon, the particular silence that meant he would need to be quiet and careful and self-sufficient until the next morning. He talked about the way that childhood had given him a radar for other people's pain that he had never been able to turn off. He said, "You walk into a room and you know immediately who is suffering and who is pretending they're not. That's not a skill I developed. It's something I was trained into by necessity before I was 10 years old." Grobel asked, "Does that ever get exhausting?" Brando looked at him with an expression that was the closest thing to a smile he'd produced in the last hour. He said, "Does breathing get exhausting? It's just what I do. I can't turn it off. I've tried. I can turn off the external response to it. I can sit in a room full of pain and appear perfectly comfortable. But the awareness doesn't stop. It's always running." He said, "That's what I use. When I play someone in extremis, someone at the furthest edge of what a person can bear, I don't have to imagine what that feels like. I just stop managing the awareness. I just let what's already running come to the surface. People think acting is putting something on. For me, it was always taking something off, taking off the management, letting the actual thing be visible for a few minutes before I put the management back on." He stopped. He thought about what he had just said. Then he said, "That's probably the most honest thing I've ever said to a journalist. You should know it won't happen again." Grobel smiled. He said, "I know," and that was it. The interview was over shortly after, not because it had run out of material, but because Brando stood up with the decision visible in his body and extended his hand and said that he thought they had probably covered enough ground for one afternoon. He said it without coldness. He said it the way you end a conversation that has given you something, with a kind of quiet completion. Grobel shook his hand and gathered his recorder and his notes and walked to the door. And just before he stepped out into the hallway, Brando said one more thing. Not 7 words this time, just 3. "Thank you," he said. Grobel turned. Brando was standing in the middle of the room, hands in his pockets, looking at some point slightly past the door. He said, "People don't usually actually listen. You actually listened. It's a rarer thing than you'd think." Grobel would write about that afternoon many times over the years. He would describe it as the interview that changed how he understood his work. He would say that he had gone in expecting to talk about Apocalypse Now, and had come out with something he didn't have a category for yet. He would say that the 7 words, "My father never once said well done," had stayed in him in the way that certain things stay. Embedded, structural, part of how you process everything that comes after. Because those 7 words were not a revelation about Marlon Brando specifically. Or rather, they were that, but they were also something larger. They were a statement about the inheritance that passes between fathers and sons and daughters across generations, quietly, without ceremony, without anyone choosing for it to happen. The silence that Marlon Brando Sr. carried from his own father, whoever that man was, whatever that childhood was, had been passed without intention into his son. And his son had spent his entire life on stage, on screen, in hotel suites, in the private dark of his own mind, trying to understand what had been given to him and whether he could give something different to the people who came after. Some of us watching this understand something about that particular project. The project of trying to offer your children the thing that was withheld from you, when the withholding is all you know as a template. It is not a simple project. It does not complete cleanly. You get partway there usually. You get further than the generation before you sometimes. You do not arrive at fully fixed. You arrive at better if you're lucky. If you kept trying. Marlon Brando kept trying until the end. He died in July 2004. In the years after Cheyenne's death, in the years after Christian's imprisonment, in the long final chapter on Tetiaroa, and in Los Angeles, he had kept trying to be present in the way he had never quite managed when it would have been most straightforward. His surviving children spoke about him in his final years with the careful, complicated love of people who had received something imperfect from someone who was trying. That is not a small thing. That is actually, if you look at it honestly, an enormous thing. Because trying, genuinely trying, without the guarantee of success, without the assurance that the effort will be received or recognized or enough, trying is where the story either goes somewhere different or stays the same. Marlon Brando's story went somewhere different. Not because he solved what his father had given him, but because in a hotel suite in Los Angeles in October 1979, in front of a journalist with his pen set down, he said the true thing without the protection of a character to say it through, and then he kept saying it in different ways to the people who needed to hear it. 7 words. "My father never once said, 'Well done,' and then a lifetime of deciding what to do about it. Some inheritances you keep, some you break, some you hand back, quietly, in the only language available to you." Brando handed his back the only way he knew how. Not perfectly, not on schedule, not without the damage that accumulates when you learn something important too late. But he handed it back. He sat in the room, he let the awareness surface, he stopped managing. And somewhere in that there was a man who was no longer his father's silence. Just a man, trying imperfectly and seriously to say the thing his own father never found the words for. Well done. He just needed 50 years to get there.